Welcome now to the Renaissance. We're going to go back in time today here at Hilton High School in our World History 2 class. This is a nice period of time from about 1350 to about 1600. So let's go, and here's what we're going to talk about. These are our objectives, and these are very broad. We're going to talk about the Renaissance, which is a rebirth of classical knowledge and what we call the birth of the new modern Western world. It's going to start in Italy, and it's going to spread out to Northern Europe. We'll talk about that. And then we're going to talk about some of the accomplishments in the visual arts, art and sculpture, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci. If you've watched the Da Vinci Code movies, you've heard about him. And Albrecht Dürer, he's probably unfamiliar to most people listening to, but he's a famous German Renaissance painter. We're going to look at literature, some of the great writers, Machiavelli, one of my personal favorites, Erasmus, and Shakespeare, who most of you have probably heard of. And we're going to look at some intellectual ideas, two specifically being humanism and secularism, and we'll define those when we get to it. So to start off with, what was the Renaissance? It's the rebirth of the ideas from the Greek and the Roman cultures. There was a writer out. He was out reading looking for old documents in some monasteries and found some writings from back in from Greece and Rome. And he read those and he brought them back to Italy, and they started saying, well, hey, why don't we start rethinking this way? Well, when was it? It was about 1350, to 1600 AD. And so this is quite a long time ago. You'll notice 1600 was just before the English started their first permanent settlements here in the New World. And it's a rebirth from what? Well, it's a rebirth from the Middle Ages. Another term for the Middle Ages is the Dark Ages, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. And it really started in the Italian city-states because there was no, quote, Italy back then. Italy didn't come around until the 1870s. So about almost 300 years from what we're talking about now. But the Italian city-states of Florence, Venice, and Genoa. And these were big trading sites that linked a lot of the trade routes we talked about in an earlier blog. So what were the Middle Ages? Well, back centuries ago, you had the Greek and Roman civilizations. In World History 1, you may have learned about the Greek and Roman empires. Socrates, Plato, the Caesars. Well, the Roman Empire collapsed in 476, and when it collapsed, chaos came because the Romans were in charge of everything, and it brought order. Well, when it collapsed, everybody fell into disorder. You see a picture here. There were wars, there was destruction, there was plague, millions of people died. Basically, in terms that most of us can understand, this period of time, this about 1,000 years, life sucked. Okay, it was just a horrible life. You did not live very long. The quality of life was you just lived to survive. You might as well have been living back in caveman times. It was just a horrible, horrible life. And then started toward the end of that, in about 1350, you had the Renaissance that came about. And then you see life starting to get better. People are being more educated. Quality of life is going up. Big cities are forming. Music is coming back. And that's what we're going to talk about. So why Italy? Well, here's Italy from our geography block earlier in World History 2. You see all the trade. We talked about the North Africa trade route before. We talked about the Silk Road that all ended out in here. We talked about the Northern European routes, the Western European routes. Well, Italy just happened to be the center of all of that. So that was very lucky for them. So why Italy? Well, number one was geography. We just talked about that. Where all those rivers and where all those ports were, thriving urban cities. And urban means there's lots of big buildings and there's lots of people in very dense areas. Washington, D.C., Chicago, Illinois, Los Angeles, those are big urban cities. There's lots of things going on. That's what thriving means. People are living, they're working. They don't have to worry about too many things. There's always a constant something going on. And they had wealthy merchants. We'll talk about one of the big families here, but very few people owned all this trade, and they became very wealthy from that. They wanted to give back, as well as the Italian boot is the home of all the Roman culture. So they had that history to go back on, and old ruins just all around their cities that they could look at. But the big idea is that all the wealth that accumulated, which means it was gained from the European trade with the Middle East, led to the rise of the Italian city-states. So what was an Italian city? Well, why Italy? We just talked about these. Large growth in the cities, lots of trade. We talked about this one a moment ago. The cities were places where the intellectual revolution happened. That's where smart people were. They got to sit and think. They could read and write Latin. They could read and write Greek. They learned all that and said, what does this mean to us today? How can we make life better? And then the survivors of the plague, they could demand higher wages because they weren't going to die. So that's a good thing. And then merchants couldn't buy anything else because they already owned all the companies. They already owned all the business. So they decided to pursue art, painting, sculptures, to try and get their ideas of a better world in Roman and Greek culture and philosophy out to the world through art and sculpture. You look at some of the big things. These are all in Rome. There's the old Roman Colosseum, where they had circuses, what we call circuses today. Back then they called them games, the gladiators. The Pantheon was built way back in Roman times. Excuse me. So it was there to give them examples of what to look at. And these were the ruins of ancient Rome. This was called the Forum, where businesses and shops and government were down here. This was kind of like downtown Washington, D.C., if you think about it. So they had those ruins there. They could look back and say, we want to be more like this. So these were the city-states. You see them all in color here. They were small governments, each led from a town. So Florence was led by Florence, Genoa, Milan, Savoy was run by Turin, Venice Republic, Naples owned all of this. But France also had a claim on Naples as well. So there were many wars fought over Naples. And the Pope was in Rome, and the Pope also controlled all of this, at least when this, in the time of this photograph here. But Florence was really the epicenter. They had the most money, the biggest trade with anybody. They had the large Medici family, but they were basically just in charge of their own little area, had their own little armies. There was Florence. So a government, they were ruled as independent republics. They had their own little king, wealthy merchants. Merchants had all the money, the kings didn't. So the merchants really had all the power. But they got involved in civic life. They tried to make things better for the people, so people would have more money, could do more things, and buy more goods that they were selling. They became big sponsors of the arts. I mentioned that earlier. A sponsor means somebody who pays for it. They would commission or hire somebody to create art. In Florence, they had the Medicis, the big, large family. They were the original Godfathers, if you remember some of the Godfather movies. But they were bankers, and they would charge interest on money. This was a kind of a new thing that was going on with the Renaissance. They would charge money for you to borrow money from them. That's how they made their money, plus trade. The Medicis were a very powerful family. They also had 4 popes. 4 of that family would become popes. So at certain times they would not only own all the money, but they would also own the papacy. They could have papal blessing on a lot of things. So here's a picture of an urban, thriving city. This is Florence today. This cathedral was built in about 436. It's got Roman columns. It's got a dome to remind you of some of the different Roman architecture of the time in Greek. This was Venice. This is on the port. It's up in northern Italy on the Adriatic. This is St. Mark's Square here. Lots of trading from the routes came in through here because they had a large navy. So those are 2 of the big city-states. All right, let's look at some literature. Machiavelli, he was a political advisor to the Medici family. And when before these city-states, everything was run by the church, and the church ruled all, the cardinals, the priests. So there was really no politics. But Machiavelli was observing these when he was alive, and he wrote some guidelines on how to run city-states, how to be a leader of a city. Because it just hadn't happened before. There was no such thing. So he wrote this book called The Prince. And in this, he talks about how he thought that it was best for the ruler to have absolute power. In other words, no one can question the ruler or the prince of the state, be it the king or whoever the ruler was. He also maintained the concept of the end justifies the means. And what that means is, even if I have to break the law, or even if we have to change the law, or even if I have to do something bad, as long as I'm doing it for a good reason to get to something good at the end, then it's okay for a ruler to do that. And he also said that rulers should do good if possible. So build orphanages, make sure you have running water so people can have good sanitation, make sure people have jobs. But if you need to do evil when it's necessary, do that. So that's kind of the first big political work that was published. So he is a very influential leader. And he advised the Medici family in Florence, as well as a few others, but predominantly them. And they were a very powerful family. Petrarch, he's considered the father of humanism, and we'll talk humanism at the end when we get to the two intellectual ideas of secularism and humanism. He was a poet, and if you think back in this time, you can see he was a poet laureate. He was the most notable poet in Rome in 1341, which is a long one, 800 years ago. Back then, the church was in charge of everything. That you could only write about the church and religion, but yet he was writing poems or sonnets, a 14-line poem, where he expressed romantic love and the appreciation of nature. That was unheard of back then. You could not talk about that. You could only write about religion. So he was really the first humanist author, and those ideas will be looked at and brought about for later on and influence other writers such as Shakespeare, as an example. So those are some of the Italian ones. Let's look at art. You had Leonardo da Vinci. You may have heard of him. He painted the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper. So let's look at those two. This is the famous Mona Lisa. It's not a very big painting at all. It's maybe just about the size of your desktop that you have at school. But it's very famous for a lot of reasons. It was stolen a couple of times. They're not really sure who the painting is of. People don't know what her smile means, why they paint her in that landscape. It's a very analyzed, critical piece of art. They think it was commissioned for a family in France. Some people say the face is actually Leonardo da Vinci himself, just in feminine form. There's a lot of things out there that people believe about this, but it was painted in about 1503. And here's the Last Supper. This is a painting. It's painted on a wall. It's called a fresco. It's painted on plaster on a wall. It's actually in the dining room of a monastery, so the monks could come in and eat while looking at the Last Supper. And it was painted in 1495. So here's Jesus in the middle with his 12 disciples, and it's telling the story of when Jesus told him that he would be betrayed. But again, everybody looks lifelike. Yes, it's a painting of religion, and that was okay in Renaissance times, but it's more lifelike. It's got some depth to it. You can see the landscape in the background. All the angles come to a focal point. It doesn't look flat. But this is a very famous one. If you're ever in Italy, go take a look at it. Another artist, very prominent artist and sculptor, is Michelangelo, and he was very skilled. He was a painter and a sculptor, but he always preferred sculpting. He did not consider himself a painter, even though there are some very beautiful paintings that he did. So let's take a look at a couple of his items. So he did the La Pieta. It's a marble sculpture. This is one piece of marble. Marble is a very pretty, easy to work with stone. It's very hard. It's from Italy. But look at the detail. But also look at Jesus. He's naked. You can see his, you can see the dead face on it. This is his. This is Mary, and here they are after he was crucified. They're going to carry him off to the tomb. But you can see the actual. Look at his hands. You can see the muscles, the flowing of the robe, the detail in this one piece. He did this when he was 24 years old. Here are a few other angles. Here's one from the top. This is Mary's face. This is Jesus' face. Look how smooth, and look at the hair on that. The artwork. It's phenomenal when you look at it, especially up close. It's really really amazing, and it's in Rome, in the Vatican. Here is David. Here's another one of his statues. I did this in 1504. Look at the detail of the hair. Look at the hand. Look at the vein on the hand. Look at your own hand right now, and you can see the same veins that they did those. But this was the first statue of a human that had been done since in over 1,000 years since Rome, and it was really an amazing thing. You can see it celebrates the human body, something you could not do when the church was in charge, because it would have been banned and destroyed. But in Renaissance times, this is what they were looking for. They were wanting to celebrate the human. And then Michelangelo painted the Sistine Chapel. He didn't want to do it. He didn't consider himself an artist. But if he didn't like art, and this is what he didn't like to do, then he was amazing at it. This is the Sistine Chapel. It was the Pope's chapel, and that's where the Pope would do his services. You can see in the middle here, you'll see the creation of man, where God is creating man. So there's a painting of God creating Adam. He used the Old Testament figures from the Old Testament to draw a lot of the figures in stories within here. It's not very big either. It's maybe about the size of the dining facility there at Hilton High School. It's not when you walk into it, you're like, wow, it's not very big. It took him 4 years to paint this, the walls and everything else. It's a really amazing work of art by Michelangelo. And here's some more of the paintings here on the side. Look at the detailed work here. Angels coming down. And this is St. Peters Basilica in Rome. This is where the Pope lives, right over here. And that's also where the Sistine Chapel is. You can come over. Michelangelo designed this dome here. It started in 1547. He died while it was in construction. It finished in 1590. But does it look like anything else? It also looks like the United States Capitol dome, if you take a look here. That's what the dome was. The U.S. Capitol was designed after. Was this dome, or the dome was designed to look like that. So now let's look at some art, some painting. There's two different types. There's medieval and Renaissance. So when you look at medieval art, it appears flat. In other words, there's no depth to it. It looks like everything was just painted and everybody's standing right beside each other. There's nothing in the background. But Renaissance art looks three-dimensional. It looks like you could just walk into it and just keep walking. Medieval art is emotionless. There's no smiles. There's no sadness. There's just a face. But in Renaissance art, they have lifelike and very detailed faces. Medieval art kind of looks like they're in a comic book, to be honest with you. They look very cartoony faces. But in the Renaissance, they have... they're very emotional. It looks lifelike. Medieval focuses on religion. Renaissance uses perspective. I'll show you that on a few examples in a minute. But it makes you focus to a certain point. Renaissance also uses secular subjects, meaning non-church. That's what secular means. Non-religion based. So here's an example. This is medieval. You see, it looks very flat. It looks like everybody's standing right beside each other. You can't See how the top looks flat? This looks like it's going straight up. Maybe a little bit of perspective there, but it seems like he's just sitting there. This is pointing one way and this is pointing another. It looks like he's sitting on a flat chair that's just basically standing up. Everybody's standing right beside each other. See how the feet are going all the weird angles. There's no emotion. He's got a mustache. They all just look like they're standing there. Looks like a cartoon, like I mentioned that, and it's focused on religion. There's the king. They got all the priests around him blessing the coronation of the new king. Now let's look at Renaissance. This is a picture of Renaissance art. This is the school at Athens by Raphael. And Raphael is right here. He painted himself into it. One sure way to ensure immortality is paint yourself into your painting. But we'll talk more about this. But look how this does not look flat. There's people in the foreground. Somebody laying on the steps. As Socrates and Aristotle walk in, you've got a focal point that brings you in to the middle. It looks like death. They're in a big long hallway. People have emotion. See the anguish on a face here. It looks very lifelike. You can see the hands, the figures. It's got the perspective that grows into 3D. And that makes it a Renaissance art. So here's vanishing point, what I just showed to you. Everything goes to a spot right in the middle. Like this. Like you're looking down a train track, everything goes to the very point in the end. See how everything focuses your eye right into the middle here? That's called vanishing point and gives you some perspective. These are all the different people. They're all Greeks and Romans, ancient Greeks and Romans that they're reading about. Epicurus, who was he's writing down over here. You've got Heraclius, Ptolemy, Aristotle, Socrates, a great thinker. So all these are writers and artists and theorists and philosophers from ancient Greece and Rome who were part of they were reading on and basing their Renaissance ideas on. So some of the technologies, the big one was the printing press. It came out in the late 1400s from a guy named Gutenberg. He lived in Strasbourg, France at the time, and later moved up to Mainz, Germany. But it's credited with the greatest spread of knowledge in the world. Basically, that was the World Wide Web and the internet at the time. People could buy a book. It was later on they would start printing in their language. This is a copy of the one from Washington, D.C. There are only 41 of these original Bibles. The Bible was the first book to be printed on the printing press. And it was written in Latin, but they would later translate books into language of the people. So people who could read their own language, like German, French, and English, they could read it themselves. This was a picture of the printing press with movable type. That's actually my daughter at Albrecht Dührer's home in Germany. And she is using that to make a printed picture. So you put it in there, you push that down, it squeezes on paper and pull it out and it's done. Some other technologies. You have the reel that you've probably seen before. They came up with the reel back then. They came with the newspaper. The astrolabe to help you to read the stars and guide your ship. The crankshaft, which is used in today's cars, that was used on paddle boats. So the paddle boat was invented during the Renaissance to go up and down some of the rivers. And the arquebus. It was a type of rifle that they would use, put gunpowder down. So it was really the first gun that we had in the West. All these were invented during the Renaissance. And then later the Renaissance ideas would spread from the Papal States up north. They would go up to Germany, England, Holland, Denmark. And then you would get some of the great Rembrandt. You would have the artist, the writer Shakespeare, and a lot of others. But it changed people's ideas on life and afterlife and the way they should look at governments and other things. It took about 200 years to get from Italy to northern Europe, because there was a lot of wars up in northern Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. So things didn't spread very well. There was a lot of dominance of the church up there. So they just very differently run. So they were very reluctant to do new ideas. So it took a little longer, but that's where it spread. So let's look at a couple of the artists there. So Erasmus was a writer. He was Dutch. And he was a philosopher. That means you think about things. And he wrote a book called In Praise of Folly, which was like a story, but he made fun of the Catholic Church. He was mad at them because of things he considered they were doing wrong. He thought people should be able to read the Bible and interpret for themselves instead of having to go through a priest. He thought, I can read the Bible and I can interpret it and talk to God straight myself. Then you had William Shakespeare. You may have heard of some of his plays. He wrote Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Taming of the Shrew. He wrote dozens of plays. He also wrote sonnets and essays, just like Petrarch did. So what's a sonnet? It is a 14-line poem. So these rhyme and go together, these rhyme and go together, these rhyme and go together, and then you sum it up at the very end. And they're always about love. You can look at some examples online. They're all written very literary. You'll also notice that there's a rhythm of these that go together. So they're 10 syllables and they go stressed and unstressed, stressed and unstressed. So you're building up and then letting down. Thomas More was an English writer. He wrote a book called Utopia. Utopia means an ideal place. It was his vision of a place, an imaginary land that had no war, no corruption or crime. So it's basically like one of the new, Divergent series. It was like kind of like the Divergent series of the time where everything was fine. There was a perfect society. There was no crime. The leaders were good, and everything was fine. He later became the chief counselor to King Henry VIII, and Henry VIII had him beheaded for not accepting Henry VIII as king of the Church of England. And Albrecht Dürer, he was a Northern Renaissance artist. This is his home. This is a self-painting of him. He had very long hair. He led the German Renaissance in art. He did a lot of woodcut prints. In other words, they would take wood and draw the painting on that, but etch it out, and that would then be the print. They would use that and put paper on it and ink and press pictures out of that. So it's really a unique form of art there. But he was influenced by Raphael, who painted the School of Athens, and Da Vinci. You saw his paintings, The Last Supper, the Mona Lisa, and other things. Here are a few of his paintings. Here's the young hare. Now, he's getting into it because he is not painting religious things. Here's a picture of nature. I actually mislabeled it. My apologies on that. Mislabeled two of these. This is praying hands. So yes, it's a religious thing, but it's a human hand. Look at the detail of the human hand. This is a rabbit. That's obviously not religious. And this is just painting of a plant in nature. And here's a picture of one of his, somebody else that influenced him. Here's a picture of Erasmus, who we talked about earlier, was the Dutch writer who wrote In Praise of Folly, criticizing the church. Now let's look at two intellectual ideas. One is humanism. We mentioned earlier that Petrarch was kind of the father of humanism. He started writing about love and nature and things like that. But humanism is an idea where you emphasize the value of human beings, and you prefer those who think critically. In other words, why are we doing this? Why do I have to go to church on Sunday? Why do I have to pray so much? Why can I only read the Bible? These different things, and you're looking at evidence, okay? Because the church says the earth is the center of the universe. Whereas if you look at the evidence in science, you remember Copernicus told us that, hey, Copernicus and Galileo, they studied the stars. They found out there were other planets. They found out that the sun was actually the center of our Milky Way, and we revolved around the sun, not the other way around. So they valued those people who thought through things and why they happened, not just accepting the beliefs of the church just because they said it was so. That's what humanism is. Now, we're not saying that the church was wrong. And you shouldn't believe the church. Everybody must practice their own faith. I'm just explaining the term humanism, but it came about during the Renaissance as people began to think for themselves, and it was accepted to think for yourself. And a lot of that was brought about by trade and ideas. They started getting different things. And why can't we, why are the Chinese smart enough to come with a compass and we're not? Why do silkworms live in China and not in Italy? They started thinking about these things. That's the importance of those trade routes. Secularism is an idea that had not been around for a long time, because during the Dark Ages, the church was the government, and the government was the church. The church owned the kings. The church appointed the kings. Everything came from the religious institutions. But in secularism, they started to question that, and they said, we no longer want the church and the government to be the same. We want church and government to be separate. We don't want laws that are based on religion. We don't want the church to be in charge of the king. We want them to be separate. We want those things to be not joined. Yes, the church is fine. Have that, but let the church leaders be in charge of the church. So if you look down at the bottom, the church started to lose members because they were looking for answers other than, well, God said so, or because the Pope said so. So the church, why did things happen? Why were silkworms in China and not here? Well, the church said it was because of faith, because God only put them there. Secularists look at, well, what's the fact? Is it too cold in Italy? Do they have the wrong types of plants? What's the science behind it? They thought it through. So that pretty much wraps up everything we're going to talk about with the Renaissance. So it was a very artistic period. And we spelled these letters out. This is a very good slide somebody put together. It's very artistic. So if you can remember that, it was the arrival or birth of the modern world that we know today. It was a rebirth of the ancient Greek and Roman cultures. The Renaissance started in the Italian city-states. These are kind of like little ways to help you remember things. There were Italian artists, Michelangelo, Da Vinci. There were sonnets, essays, and plays. Example, Shakespeare. The Renaissance spread to Northern Europe. Individualism is stressed and rewarded, and church corruption is criticized. And this is going to lead us into the next block, which is going to be the Reformation, where the church kind of splits. So you got Erasmus with a Northern Renaissance humanist saying, why is the church corrupt? Why are they doing these things? So in conclusion, trade that we talked about from the trade routes unit brought wealth and new ideas and products to the Western world. Merchants made a lot of money, and they wanted to invest that and make the world better. The Renaissance brought about Greek and Roman culture and ideas. The merchants made investments in art, architecture, philosophy, science. Because of all that, people are starting to question things and starting to value humans, and that's where humanism and secularism began, and it's really started to spread. And then the Renaissance spread to Northern Europe toward the end of it in Italy, and that's Germany, was today Germany, England, the Netherlands, and others. So I hope you got something out of this. I appreciate your time. All the best to you. Leave comments, and we'll see you for the next block of instruction.